And these are the vertebrates, the phylum Chordata, or they having a cord into their bodies, along their bodies. They have internal skeleton, internal skeletal structure. And the phylum Chordata contains not only vertebrate species having a hard endoskeleton, they are having some species which are most primitive, having a very soft internal cord, and they are looking very much like the invertebrates. For example, the Osteichthyes. They are coral-like creatures or anemone-like creatures without skeleton, without external or internal hard structure, but they have a primitive internal cord, which is something like vestigial vertebra inside. And these are the Osteichthyes. You can see they are not looking like vertebrates. The most primitive creatures which have a very primitive internal structure resembling the skeleton. You can see here. These are marine creatures living in the warm oceans and seas. At the bottom area, sedentary. And they have a relatively complex structure which you don't have to remember. Just notice that it's a complex and it's resembling the internal structure of the higher vertebrates. As you remember the schemes of the previous invertebrates which I showed you, a very few stuff was shown, and here it's a lot. And we are beginning with the vertebrates, the true vertebrates. And again, the classification which I present to you is a simple one, which is accepted for a base knowledge on zoology. Now it's more complex. And again, as I was talking about the evolutionary theory, modern scientists dig into the molecules and make taxonomical changes. So don't mind about this, accept this simple classification, which is okay for now. And the most primitive class are the cartilaginous fishes, Chondrichthyes. Most famous of them are the sharks and the stingrays. Many of them are eating animal food. Some are active predators, searching and catching their prey. For example, some of the stingrays use even electricity to kill their prey. You know the sharks, the great white shark, by aggressive bites is killing their prey. A lot of seals, for example. These fish does not have hard skeletal structures. Instead, they have these cartilaginous structures inside. All of them breathing with gills, and as I said, variety of species concerning their ecology. They can live in the bottom of the oceans. Many are living in salt waters. Some of the stingrays can live in fresh waters, for example, in the Amazon area, in the Amazon River. There are a variety of freshwater species. But you can meet a lot of them in, for example, at the areas of the coral reefs, in the open waters of the oceans and the seas. Many of the stingrays have poisonous Glands, used for protection mainly. Some are plankton eaters, like this whale shark here. This is the largest fish existing on Earth now. Plankton feeder. The mantis also. The great white shark. You can see this is the largest predatory shark on Earth. In previous times, during the Miocene era, it was the megalodon shark. Maybe you know the megalodon. You can imagine how big it was. And the manta ray, which I mentioned, living in open water, in the oceans. A very large animal, sometimes in groups, living when feeding on plankton. Here you can see a symbiotic fish attached to its body. Commensalic is more correct because the fish has benefits. It has protection and transportation by the manta ray. The manta ray does not matter about this small fish. And these are a species which can produce electricity in its fresh water in the Amazon area. Brazilian electric ray. The other class, the true bony fishes, Osteichthyes. You can see here some examples, even the pet goldfishes are in this group, the bony fishes. What is the difference from the cartilaginous fishes concerning their external morphology? They have a protective structures of the epithelium called scales, hard structures which protect their body from the environmental factors, predators, the scales. Complex structures arranged specific way with a great taxonomic value in many species. There are some families, maybe with which you are familiar, with the family Cyprinidae or the carpfish. Sometimes I mentioned them when we are talking about the parasites, for example, the Diplosome paradoxum and the other parasitic species of worms. The common carp, Cyprinus carpio, very often cultivated by humans and also need specific veterinary help in some cases concerning parasites, internal or external. So this is one of the objects of the vets. Family Esucidae or the pikes. In Europe we have one species, the common pike, Esox lucius, one of the ferocious predators in our swamps and slow-standing or slow-running waters. Having this big mouth, active predator, but attacking the prey from ambush. It is staying into the water vegetation or under a log or something and awaiting the prey, and is very fast in short distances. It's not actively chasing the prey as other species which are predatory. It's ambush predator, very fast but in short distances, something like the lions doing. The difference between the lions and the cheetahs. Lions are ambush predators, or leopards also, and the cheetahs are active chasers. Family Percidae, a little bit similar to the pikes, but from different family. European perch, or called Perca fluviatilis, predatory fish species, again in fresh waters, very often living together with the carps, with the pikes. If you are angler, maybe you know it familiar, it's aggressive when you put a bait on your hook, very easy to catch. So shortly we pass the fish and we are moving to the classes of the amphibians. So what is their name is calling? They are living in both types of environment, the terrestrial environment and the water environment, aquatic environment. They have developed during evolution in freshwater basins. So rarely you can see an amphibian into the sea or into the ocean. There are some species of toads with very thick skin, which is well adapted not to be harmed by the salt water, and they can swim. For example, the cane toad, or the European, a big brown toad, buffo buff. But as a rule, they have very gentle skin. And this skin has to be always wet. It has a lot of glands, which moisture this skin. If, for example, you put an amphibian in a dry area, it could die for an hour or even minutes in very hot weather. And being a transitional form between the fish and the reptiles, the true terrestrial species, these spend part of their life into the water where they reproduce. So amphibians always reproduce in fresh water. It doesn't matter how well adapted are they to terrestrial environment. Some species, for example, in the rainforests, reproduce in the very small amounts of water into the big leaves of the tropical plants. So in a particular part of the year, amphibians enter into the water, copulate, and lay their eggs there in the water. The eggs are developing into the water, and from the eggs, a larvae are hatching. There are different types of amphibians, and some, as the larvae of the salamanders and the newts, firstly, in these amphibians, firstly the front legs are appearing during metamorphosis. In the frogs, which have larvae which are called tadpoles, firstly the hind legs emerge. The larvae of the frogs are eating mainly dead organic matter. Very few are predators, there are some filtrators feeding on plankton. But most of them are feeding on algae or detritic matter. It's important to know that most of the larvae of the newts and the salamanders are predatory and feeding on small invertebrates. Even larger species can catch smaller tadpoles or amphipods and other invertebrates and small fish also. So again, very gentle skin without any scale structures, but a lot of glands. Some species have even poisonous glands. One of the most poisonous, for example, tree frog species are living in the Amazon jungle, and local people, the native Indians, use them for hunting. They are putting their poison at the top of their arrows and going to hunt monkeys and birds into the jungle with this poison. Some of these glands also, it's interesting, can produce hallucinogenic or psychedelic substances. And there are some shamans in the Indian tribes of South America and Central America which are used in their rituals. The first subclass is the subclass of the frogs. Anura means that they don't have a tail. And some of the common species of Europe. So, the common frog, here in my lectures, I gave a lot of examples for the larger part of auditory concerning the Mediterranean, but this species is in favor of our British colleagues, because this species is common in the central, northern Europe and Britain. The Rana temporaria. In our area, in Greece and Bulgaria, we call it mountain species, because it's a cold-loving species. And here, in these warm parts of Europe, it is living mainly in the mountain areas. But you can meet it a lot in the lowlands of Central, Northern Europe and Britain. The European tree frog, the most beautiful of our European frogs. As a whole, the frogs are one of my favorite animals. I don't study them, but they are a favorite of mine. When I go to the tropical areas, I'm always looking for frogs and making a lot of photographs and sending, uploading them in iNaturalist. Maybe you know this social network for naturalists. iNaturalist. You can search for this in internet. Very useful. You can upload photographs of animals, and specialists or amateurs, nature-loving people can identify your species. And it's very important also for the distribution of the species. Scientists can use the whole database of iNaturalist and summarize the data and make very serious scientific publications. So you will contribute into the science when uploading photographs in iNaturalist. So this is the only species in Europe living in trees. And again, about the taxonomy and molecules. Scientists found that there is not only one species, there are a few of them. They discern them from their song during breeding period, and biogenetic studies found that this is a group of species very closely related and very similar morphologically. This is in one of the species which can change its color according to the surrounding environment. It can be greenish, yellowish, or brownish. It can change its color like the chameleons. And the common toad, Bufu bufu, which I mentioned, is the toughest European frog, which can can swim for a little in salt water also. And it's one of the most poisonous. So it's not a problem to hold the species by your hands, but be careful, because these are the poisonous glands here. These glands are two situated at the lateral sides of the head, or behind the head of the animal. And when you make little pressure on them, even the poison can fly. So be careful of your eyes and mouth. Not so dangerous to humans, as I said, but for example, some aggressive domestic dogs are poisoned because they are attacking these frogs and biting them. So if you have a dog and it wants to bite this frog, don't let it to do it, because it can die. But very beneficial animals, eating a lot of pests in the gardens. So keep them, look for them. For example, in my garden I have frog ponds. It's not a fish pond, it's a frog pond, a little swamp in my yard, in which these and other species reproduce, and they are very welcome in my yard, as a lot of animals, of course. There are hedgehogs, and soon one badger passed to my yard. The other subclass, these are the newts and salamanders. They have tails, and other specification which I mentioned in the previous slides. And the so-called fire salamander, Salamander salamandra. This is an European species. There are also a few of them in Central and Western Europe, but here in the Balkans, the fire salamander is most likely distributed, and again cold-loving species living in the higher mountains here in Bulgaria about 7 to 800 meters above sea level. Why it's called fire salamander? There is a myth that these animals can go through fire and survive. So they're quite adapted to dry environments, and it's partly true, but don't put them in fire. The newts, the smooth newt or the common newt, Triton vulgaris, is other species of these amphibians with a tail. And during breeding season, you can see the male is developing this wonderful crest. And after mating, this crest is absorbed by phagocytosis, and they are looking like the females, much like the females, and living into the moist areas around the water basins, under wet logs, tree trunks, stones, and in the leaf litter, going out very rarely after rain. But during breeding season, they are going into the water. What is specific for this species? Their breeding season is very early in the year. They are going into the water for reproduction during about February, March, when it's cold, and when the predators which are feeding on them are not so active, like the pond turtles, like the common frogs, and other. So they use this period to reproduce. Because unlike the salamanders are poisonous and they have few predators. The newts are harmless. Everything can eat newts. They are not poisonous. That's why they avoid the predators during February and reproduce. This is the great crested newt. Again, scientists with their molecules found that it's a group of species, especially on Balkans. There are over 5 species. But in the near past, we thought that there is only one species, great crested newt. Triturus cristatus means crested cristatus. A little bit bigger than the previous species, and sometimes can feed on its larvae, for example. Again, going into the water for reproduction during February. The males again developing this crest-like structure on their head and back, which is absorbed after the breeding season, and they are going out of the water. Specific for the amphibians as a whole is this, that they can breathe equally by lungs and by their skin. About 50% they are breathing through the skin. That's why this skin has to be moistured very often also. It is an organ used for breathing. In other vertebrates, for example humans, the skin breathing is also a lot, big percent. But in this creature it's 50%. There are some experiments, cruel experiments in the past, which were to remove the lungs of the amphibian by operation, and the amphibian continued to live, only breathing through its skin. So it is a very important organ for breathing.